Some things you build to last: a foundation, a marriage, a reputation for doing what you say you are going to do. I have spent 44 years in this world building things, literally, physically building them with my hands and my back, and the particular kind of patience that comes from knowing that good construction is not rushed and cannot be faked. My name is Victor Hargrove. I am 56 years old. I am a masonry contractor by trade, second generation, trained by my father who was trained by his, and I have spent 30 years building walls, footings, retaining structures, foundations, and everything in between for residential and commercial clients across Pemberton County, Tennessee. I know concrete. I know block. I know mortar rebar, compacted gravel base, curing times, structural load, and the specific sound a properly built wall makes when you knock on it, which is the sound of something that is not moving. I also know, with 30 years of professional certainty, how fast a properly prepared concrete wall can go up when you have the right crew, the right materials staged and ready, and a very good reason to finish before sunrise. But I am getting ahead of myself. That comes later. First, you need to understand Sandra Prewitt, and to understand Sandra Prewitt you need to understand the land. My property in Ridgemont Hollow sits on just under 3 acres at the eastern edge of the Ridgemont Hollow HOA development, which is a 42-home community built on what used to be a horse farm in the late 1990s. The lots in Ridgemont Hollow are larger than typical HOA lots. Most of them run between 1 and 2 acres, because the developer had preserved the pastoral character of the original land instead of subdividing it into postage stamp parcels. My lot at the eastern boundary has a house, a detached workshop large enough to be called a small barn, and a rear section of just under 1.5 acres that is partially wooded with mature cedars and hickories along the back boundary line, and opens into a grass clearing in the middle that I use for staging materials during large jobs, and for the occasional bonfire when the season is right and the neighbors I like are available. The eastern boundary of my property is marked by a cedar post fence I installed myself 8 years ago when I bought the place, treated 4x4 posts set 18 inches deep in concrete footings, 3 runs of wire, property pins verified by a licensed surveyor before I dug the first hole. I know exactly where my property ends because I put the fence exactly where the survey said to put it, and I have the documentation to prove both. The fence runs 211 feet from the corner of my rear lot line to where it meets the tree line at the back, and it has been in exactly that location for 8 years without moving, because concrete footings in proper post holes do not move. Sandra Prewitt moved into the development 3 years ago. She bought the property immediately east of mine, a 2-acre lot with a house that she renovated extensively before moving in, and a rear section that backed up to my eastern boundary fence. She was, by all external appearances, a successful woman, late 40s, drove a new Range Rover, had the landscaping done professionally, kept the house impeccably. She was also, as I learned incrementally over the 18 months following her arrival, someone who experienced the boundary between her property and other people's property as a suggestion rather than a fact. It started small, the way these things always start. The first time I noticed anything was in the spring of her first year, when I found tire tracks in my rear clearing. Not car tracks, narrower than that, with the knobby tread pattern of an ATV. They crossed my clearing diagonally from the southeast corner to the northwest, entering through a section of fence where 2 posts had been pulled, not broken, pulled, worked loose over time, and exiting through the tree line toward the interior of the development's common wooded area. I examined the fence section carefully. The posts had been loosened from the outside, from Sandra's property side. I reset the posts in fresh concrete and replaced the wire. I did not call Sandra that day because I could not prove who had done it, and because I am not a man who makes accusations he cannot support. I filed the incident in my memory and kept my eyes open. The tracks came back 6 weeks later. Same diagonal crossing, same entry point, same loosened fence posts. This time I also found a section of wire that had been pushed down and pinned with a rock, a deliberate modification, not accidental damage. I fixed the fence again. This time I also walked the property line and put up 2 game cameras, one covering the southeast entry point and one covering the interior of my clearing, mounted on trees at a height, an angle that would capture anything crossing through. I had learned the value of cameras from a colleague who had dealt with a similar trespass situation on his rural property the year before. He said, "Document everything before you say a word." I thought that was good advice. I checked the cameras at the end of the following week. Sandra Prewitt appeared in 47 photographs taken over 4 separate sessions on 3 different days. She was riding a red and black Polaris ATV, wearing a helmet, gloves, and what appeared to be riding gear. She entered through the southeast corner of my fence on each occasion, crossed the full diagonal of my clearing, exited through the tree line, and returned by the same route. On the 4th session, she had a passenger, a woman I did not recognize, also helmeted, sitting behind her on the machine. Both of them looked relaxed. Both of them looked like people who had done this many times before and expected to continue doing it. I sat with those photographs for 3 days. I brought them inside and printed them and laid them on my kitchen table and looked at them. I counted the sessions captured on camera and thought about the sessions that had probably been happening before I installed the cameras. I thought about the fence posts she had worked loose, not once but twice, and the wire she had deliberately pinned with a rock to create a gap she could pass through on a machine. I thought about the diagonal path she took, which was the most efficient line across my property between her rear yard and the common wooded area, and I understood that she had made a decision at some point, probably early, probably within weeks of moving in, that my land was a more convenient route than going around it, and that she had simply started using it. That decision was not made in ignorance. You do not loosen 4x4 posts set in concrete footings accidentally. You do not pin fence wire with a rock by mistake. Sandra Prewitt had assessed my property, determined that it offered a useful path to where she wanted to go, and proceeded to create that path by dismantling the physical markers of my ownership. She did this quietly, incrementally, and with the complete confidence of someone who had either never considered that this was not her right or had considered it and decided it did not apply to her. I am a patient man. I have the patience of someone who sets footings properly and waits for concrete to cure before loading it. But I am not infinitely patient, and I am not a man who mistakes patience for acceptance. I called a property attorney named James Whitfield, whose office was in Pemberton County and who had done work for me on a commercial contract dispute 3 years earlier. I emailed him the photographs before the call so he could look at them while we talked. He picked up on the second ring and said, "Victor, I've looked at the photos. This is straightforward trespass. Repeated, documented, deliberate. You have everything you need." He said I had 3 options. I could send a cease and desist letter, which would put her on formal notice. I could file a trespass complaint with the sheriff, which would create a law enforcement record. Or I could do both simultaneously, which he recommended, since the letter alone sometimes invited negotiation, and I had not indicated any desire to negotiate. I said I had no desire to negotiate. He said, "Good, let me draft the letter and you go to the sheriff." I went to the Pemberton County Sheriff's substation the next morning and spoke to a deputy named Carl Atkins, who had the careful manner of someone who took property rights seriously, which in rural Tennessee is not an unusual quality in a law enforcement officer. Carl looked at my photographs, examined my survey documentation confirming the property line, and took a formal report. He said he would make contact with Sandra Prewitt. He also said, and I thought this was worth noting, that if the situation continued after formal notice, the trespass would be treated as criminal rather than civil, which in Tennessee carried actual consequences. James Whitfield's letter went out certified mail the same day. It was 2 pages. It described the trespass, referenced the photographic documentation and the police report number, cited the relevant Tennessee trespass statutes, and demanded that Sandra Prewitt immediately cease and desist from entering my property by any means, that she make no further modifications to my fencing, and that she acknowledge in writing within 10 days that she understood her access to my property was unauthorized and had ended permanently. Deputy Carl visited Sandra Prewitt that Thursday afternoon. I know this because Carl called me afterward and said he had spoken with her. He said her initial response was to claim the path she had been using was an established right-of-way. Carl had explained to her that rights of way must be documented in the property deed or established through formal legal process, and that neither applied here. He said she had then said that she had not realized the path crossed my property. Carl told me he had shown her the survey map I had provided, and she had been quiet for a moment, and then said she understood. James Whitfield's letter received a response through Sandra's attorney. She had won, apparently, on retainer, 11 days after it was sent. The response did not acknowledge wrongdoing. It said Sandra disputed that the path she had been using crossed my property. It said she believed the path was on a common area easement. It did not provide any documentation of this easement because, as I knew from my own survey work and from a direct conversation with the HOA's property manager, no such easement existed anywhere in the Ridgemont Hollow recorded plat. I sent James the response. He said, "Victor, she's going to make this complicated." I said I knew. He said, "What's your long-term goal here? Because if she's disputing the boundary, we can litigate it, but it'll take time, or there's a faster option." I asked what the faster option was. He said, "Make access physically impossible. If there is no gap in your fence, there is nothing to dispute." I said I had already fixed the fence twice. He said, "I don't mean fix the fence. I mean put up something she can't work loose." I sat with that for exactly as long as it took me to understand that he was right. I went out to my rear property that afternoon and walked the full 211 feet of fence line. I measured the southeast corner section, the entry point Sandra had been using, which was a 14-foot span between the corner post and the next line post. Then I looked at the ground and thought about footings. The soil in that section was clay-heavy, which meant it was firm and stable and held footings well, but required some drainage consideration. There was a slight grade that ran downhill towards Sandra's property, which was useful for drainage. The area was fully on my property, inside my fence line by at least 6 feet, confirmed by my survey markers. I went home and pulled up my materials inventory. I thought about what I was going to build and what it was going to take to build it in a single overnight operation. Because I had decided, and I want to be honest about when this decision was made, which was approximately 3 minutes into that afternoon walk along the fence line, that whatever went up was going up fast enough that Sandra Prewitt would not have time to seek an injunction or involve the HOA or create any other procedural obstacle before the concrete was cured, and the matter was settled by physics rather than argument. I'm a masonry contractor. I have built things overnight before, a retaining wall for a commercial client who had a hard deadline, a foundation repair that could not wait for weather. I know what it takes to mobilize a crew after dark and work through to morning and end up with something solid. I know how to stage materials so there is no wasted motion. I know how to sequence work so every person has something to do and nothing waits on anything else. I have done this. I could do it here. What I planned was not complicated. It was, in fact, extremely simple from a structural standpoint, which was part of why it could be done quickly. A concrete masonry unit wall, 8 feet tall, reinforced cores at every fourth block, cap course on top, footed on a poured concrete strip footing 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep. The wall would run the full 14 feet of the southeast entry span, anchored to my existing fence posts at each end. It would sit entirely on my property. It would require no HOA approval because it was not visible from any street and was not replacing a fence. It was an interior property structure which fell under a different provision of the Ridgemont Hollow covenants and required only that it not exceed the height limit for interior structures, which was 10 feet. 8 feet was well under 10 feet. I called my crew chief, a man named Darnell Reese who had worked with me for 14 years and who, when I called him at 7 in the evening and explained what I needed, said only, "What time do we start?" I said 11 tonight. He said he would have 3 men there and the mixer running by 10:50. I said good. I called the block supplier, who I had a standing account with and who had an after-hours emergency line for exactly the situations that arise in commercial masonry work where timelines cannot wait for business hours. I ordered what I needed and arranged delivery at 10:30. I called James Whitfield the following morning. He said, "Did you do it?" I said I did. He said, "Is it standing?" I said it was cured enough by morning that it was not going anywhere, and that it would be at full structural strength within 28 days, which is what concrete does when you mix it correctly and cure it properly. He said, "Victor, I need to ask you something. Was everything you built on your property?" I said yes. I said every inch of footing, every block, every reinforced core was inside my survey line, and I had the photographs from the build to prove it, because Darnell had taken time-stamped photos throughout the night documenting the progress and the position relative to the survey stakes I had redriven that afternoon. James said, "Good, because she's going to call someone this morning." I said I expected that. He was right about the timing. Sandra Pruitt called the HOA at 8:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because the HOA property manager, a woman named Trudy Calhoun, who had always been straightforward with me, called me at 9:15 and said, "Victor, I've just had a very upset phone call from your neighbor. Can you tell me what happened?" I told Trudy what happened. I told her about the trespass, the photographs, the loosened fence posts, the pinned wire, the police report, James Whitfield's letter, Sandra's attorney's response disputing the boundary, and the wall I had built overnight on my property within the height limits specified in the covenants for interior structures. I offered to send her the photographic documentation from the build and the survey markers confirmation. Trudy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Victor, did you pull any permits?" I said interior structures on private property within the covenant's specified parameters did not require HOA approval and did not require a county permit at that height and setback. She said she'd have to verify that. I said I'd already verified it, and she was welcome to call the county building department. She called me back at 11:15. She said the county building department confirmed that the structure as described did not require a permit. She said the HOA's Covenants Council had reviewed the relevant provisions and confirmed that the structure was within the permitted parameters for interior private property improvements. She said she was sorry, but she did not have grounds to require the wall's removal. Sandra Pruitt's attorney sent a letter 3 days later demanding the wall be removed on the grounds that it constituted a spite fence erected in retaliation for a boundary dispute, citing Tennessee's spite fence statute. I sent the letter to James. He called me that afternoon and said, "Victor, a spite fence statute applies to fences erected with the primary purpose of harassing a neighbor, not to legitimate boundary enclosure structures built to protect a property from documented trespass. You have a police report, a cease and desist letter, photographic evidence of repeated trespass, and a survey confirming the boundary. Your wall is a boundary enclosure built to prevent unauthorized access to your property. That is its purpose. I can defend this." I said, "Defend it then." He said he would. The response to Sandra's attorney went out the following week. I did not read it in detail because James said the relevant legal arguments were established and he had them in hand. I went back to work. I had 3 jobs running that week and a crew to manage and materials to coordinate and estimates to write, which is the life of a contractor in the spring when everyone who thought about a project all winter finally calls to get it done. But on Friday evening of that week, after the crew had gone home and the tools were put away and the day was finished, I drove out to the back of my property and stood in front of what Darnell and his men and I had built in one overnight session 5 days earlier. It was 8 feet of solid CMU, cap block on top, stucco finish on the exterior face that I had applied the day after construction because I do not leave raw block exposed if I can help it. The color was a warm gray that matched the stone foundation of my house. It was level, plumb, and square. The mortar joints were clean. The reinforced cores had been filled to the top. The footing ran true and deep. I knocked on it with my knuckles, the way my father taught me to knock on a wall to hear what it was made of. It made the sound of something that was not going anywhere. HOA Karen used my land as her private ATV trail, so I built a concrete wall overnight. Sandra Pruitt's attorney did not respond to James Whitfield's letter for 11 days. In that time, 2 things happened that were worth noting. The first was that Deputy Carl Atkins called to inform me that Sandra had made a complaint to the sheriff's office alleging that my wall constituted a civil rights violation, which Carl explained to me with a patience that suggested he had been on the phone with some difficult people that week. He said the complaint had been reviewed and was without merit and had been closed. He also said that given the history of documented trespass and the failure to provide any credible evidence of an easement, his office was prepared to treat any future entry onto my property by Sandra Pruitt as criminal trespass rather than civil. I thanked him for the call. The second thing that happened was that Darnell Reese's wife, who worked at the county assessor's office, mentioned to Darnell over dinner one evening that she had seen a request for property records come across her desk that week involving my parcel and Sandra Pruitt's parcel. Darnell mentioned this to me. I mentioned it to James. James said Sandra's attorney was probably trying to build a chain of title argument around the alleged easement, and that this was a good sign. It meant they were doing research, which meant they had not found anything that supported their position yet, because if they had, they would have filed rather than researched. He was right, they filed nothing. Sandra's attorney's response, when it finally came, was a substantially de-escalated version of the previous letter. Gone was the spite fence language. Gone was the demand for immediate removal. Instead, the letter proposed mediation to resolve the boundary dispute and suggested that in the interest of neighborly relations, the parties might explore a negotiated solution. James called me when he received it and said, in his particular economy of words, "They've checked the records and they don't have an easement." This letter is the sound of someone who wants out of a losing position. I asked what he recommended. He said, "You don't need mediation. You have a wall. The dispute is resolved." But I'd respond politely that you're open to discussion if they have documentation of any claimed easement to present, and that in the absence of such documentation, you consider the matter closed. He sent that response. Sandra's attorney did not write back. The HOA board held its next regularly scheduled meeting 6 weeks after the wall went up. I attended, as I attended all meetings. Trudy Calhoun had added property boundary matter, Lot 38, to the agenda under old business, which was the polite and neutral way of noting that a thing had happened, and the board wanted to officially record its handling of it. When the item came up, Tom Birch, the board president, a measured man who had been in the position for 5 years and who reminded me of certain foremen I had known who did their best work by staying out of the way of people who knew what they were doing, summarized the situation briefly for the full board. He noted that Trudy had confirmed county and covenant compliance for the structure, that the trespass had been documented and reported, and that the board's counsel had reviewed the matter and found no basis for any HOA action regarding the wall's removal. He then asked if there was any board discussion. There was a brief silence of the kind that means people have opinions they have decided not to voice in a recorded meeting. Then a board member named Gail Sommers, who lived 2 lots down from me and who had always been cordial at neighborhood events, said she thought it might be worth noting in the record that the situation could have been prevented if the trespass complaint had been brought to the board's attention earlier, and that residents experiencing boundary disputes were encouraged to contact the HOA as a first step before pursuing independent remedies. I said respectfully that I had pursued 2 independent remedies before the wall, a formal police report and a cease and desist letter from my attorney, neither of which had produced compliance, and that the wall was the 3rd remedy and had produced the compliance that the first 2 had not. I said I was open to any board guidance about preferred sequences for future situations, but that I had not been aware the board wished to be consulted before a property owner secured their own property against documented unauthorized entry. Gail said she understood and was just noting it for the record. I said I appreciated that. Tom closed the item. The meeting moved on. What happened with Sandra Pruitt after that played out at the slow, quiet pace of a situation that has been resolved, but whose resolution the losing party has not yet fully accepted. For the first 2 months, she was visibly present in her rear yard on a more than usual basis, and I had the clear impression from the direction she stood and looked that she was studying the wall. She made no attempt to go around it. There was nothing to go around, because my fence ran the full 211 feet and the wall sat inside it, and the only modification to the southeast corner was that where there had been a gap that could be worked loose, there was now 8 feet of solid reinforced CMU that weighed approximately 4,000 pounds and had a strip footing anchored 3 feet in the ground. She stopped riding the ATV. I know this because the path through the common wooded area that she had been accessing through my property gradually disappeared under new growth over the following season, which is what happens to informal trails when they stop being used. In October, 5 months after the wall went up, I got a letter from Sandra's attorney. It was not a threat and it was not a demand. It was a request. Sandra wished to discuss whether I would be willing to consider selling the 14-foot section of my southeast corner, which was the section the wall occupied, to enable the construction of a formal easement arrangement. I sent the letter to James. He called me and said, "Victor, she wants to buy what she was taking for free." I said that was how I read it too. He said, "What do you want to do?" I said I would need to think about it. I thought about it for a week. I walked the rear property several evenings after work, which I do when I am thinking through something, because walking familiar ground while thinking unfamiliar thoughts is a habit I have had since my father's time. I thought about whether there was any version of a formal easement arrangement that made sense. I thought about what I would need in terms of compensation to make it worthwhile, not just for the section of land, but for the 18 months of fence damage and the cost of the wall and the attorney fees and the police report, and the time I had spent on something that should not have needed any of my time. I thought about what a formal easement would look like, and whether Sandra Prewitt was the kind of person who could be trusted to respect a legal agreement when she had not respected a survey marker and a cedar post fence. I decided the answer to the last question was no. Not because I was still angry. I was not particularly angry at that point, which is what happens when a situation is resolved and the resolution has held, but because the fundamental fact of the matter was that Sandra had known the fence was mine and had worked it loose anyway, and had known the property was mine and had ridden across it anyway, and had known the boundary was documented and had disputed it anyway, and a person who does all of those things does not become a reliable easement partner by virtue of having lost the argument. I instructed James to respond that I was not interested in any sale or easement arrangement at this time. He sent that response. Sandra's attorney acknowledged receipt and did not write back. The following spring, Sandra Prewitt listed her house for sale. The listing appeared in late April and the house went under contract in 3 weeks. It was a good property, well-maintained, good lot size, and the market was active. She was gone by mid-June. I did not speak to her before she left. There was nothing I needed to say, and I did not think there was anything she wanted to hear from me. She pulled out of her driveway on a Saturday morning with a loaded Range Rover and a moving truck behind her, and that was that. The people who bought her property were a couple named Keith and Anita Forsyth. Keith was a veterinarian and Anita taught middle school, and they had 2 kids who were immediately and enthusiastically interested in the wooded area behind the development, which they reached by way of the HOA's actual common area access path on the south side of the development, which was where the access path had always been and which did not cross anyone's private property because it had been designed correctly in the original plat and had never needed to be supplemented by trespassing across a neighbor's land. Keith introduced himself to me within a week of moving in. He shook my hand in the way that people who grew up with handshakes shake hands, which is to say firmly and with eye contact, and he said he had heard a little bit about the situation with his predecessor, and he wanted me to know he had no interest in any of that, and that if there was ever any question about the property line, he was happy to look at the survey together. I said I appreciated that and that the survey markers were all in place along the full boundary line and were easy to find if you knew what to look for. He said good. We talked for a few minutes about his practice and about the kind of work I did and parted on the easy terms of 2 men who have briefly met and expect to be decent neighbors. Anita brought over a pie the following week. It was peach. It was excellent. The wall is still there. I did not see any reason to remove it. It is a well-built structure on my property within the HOA's permitted parameters, and it sits on a proper footing that will outlast me and probably my children and possibly my grandchildren if I am lucky enough to have some. I planted a row of climbing roses along the interior face. the side that faces my property, which was Darnell's idea, and which I initially thought was somewhat absurd for a man of my particular trade, and eventually admitted was a good idea, because the roses bloomed in June and were genuinely beautiful and filled that corner of the rear yard with a smell that had no analogue in the world of masonry and concrete, and was better for being entirely different from it. My father used to say that a good wall is an honest thing. It does not pretend to be something it is not. It does not move unless you move it. It does not negotiate with weather or argument or the opinions of people who would prefer it was not there. It simply stands, and its standing is the thing it has to say, and it says it continuously and without variation from the day the concrete cures to the day someone chooses to take it down. I have not chosen to take it down. I expect I will not. There are decisions in life that you make quickly and that turn out to be correct. And there are decisions that you make slowly and that turn out to be correct. And occasionally, there are decisions that you make in about 3 minutes while walking a fence line in the afternoon, and that take 1 night and 4 men and a ready-mix truck to execute, and that turn out to be so completely, structurally, and permanently correct that you find yourself standing in front of the result 5 months later. In the light of a Tennessee October evening, listening to it say the same thing it said the morning it cured, which is that some things you build to last. I built this one to last. Thumbnail text, asterisk. She used my land as a trail. I built a wall by dawn.